1944, Western Europe. German Luftwaffe pilot Franz Adler scrambled his Focke-Wulf to intercept what he thought were American P-47 escort fighters. But instead of protecting bombers above, they dove low, unleashed 2,500 pounds of bombs on his airfield, then climbed back up to dogfight his squadron into oblivion. The Germans had trained for years to counter American tactics, but nobody told them the P-47 Thunderbolt could do that. How did a single fighter plane carrying more bombs than a medium bomber become the weapon that shattered the Luftwaffe's belief they could still win the war? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1943 settled over occupied France like a cold, heavy blanket. In the small town of Reims, where vineyards once produced the finest champagne in Europe, German soldiers now marched through cobblestone streets. The wine cellars had been emptied or locked away. The laughter of French families had grown quiet. This was the fourth year of war, and everyone could feel the weight of it pressing down on their shoulders like an iron hand. At a Luftwaffe airbase just outside the town, the morning air smelled of engine oil and frost. Mechanics worked on fighter planes lined up in neat rows, their breath making small clouds in the December cold. These were Focke-Wulf FW-1990s, some of the best fighter planes Germany had ever built. They were painted in gray and green colors that helped them hide against the sky. Each plane bore the black cross of the German Air Force on its wings. Inside the briefing room, 20 young pilots sat on wooden benches drinking weak coffee from metal cups. The coffee tasted bitter, nothing like the rich blends they remembered from before the war. Everything tasted different now. Everything felt different. But these men were the pride of the Luftwaffe, and they carried themselves with the confidence of warriors who had survived the worst the war could throw at them. Captain Franz Adler sat in the front row, his leather flying jacket worn smooth at the elbows. He was 28 years old, though his eyes looked older. Those eyes had seen the cliffs of Dover during the Battle of Britain. They had watched the endless white fields of Russia blur beneath his wings. They had seen friends spiral down in flames, trailing black smoke like ribbons in the sky. His face was lean and serious, with a small scar above his right eyebrow from a piece of shrapnel that had cut through his canopy 2 years earlier. Franz came from Bavaria, from a town nestled in green hills where church bells rang every Sunday morning. His father had flown wooden biplanes in the First War, the one they called the Great War, before this new war made it seem small. Growing up, Franz had listened to his father's stories about dogfights over the trenches, about the honor of aerial combat, about duty to the fatherland. Those stories had filled his head with dreams of clouds and glory. Now he lived those dreams, though they tasted more like smoke than glory most days. The door opened and Major Kessler walked in, carrying a leather folder under his arm. The pilots stood up quickly, their boots scraping against the wooden floor. Kessler was older, maybe 45, with gray streaks in his dark hair. He had flown in the First War alongside Franz's father. Now he commanded this squadron, sending young men into the sky every day, watching some of them never come back. "Sit down," Kessler said, and the pilots dropped back onto their benches. The major opened his folder and pinned a map to the board behind him. Red marks showed where American bombers had been hitting German positions. There were many red marks. Too many. "Intelligence reports more American bomber formations heading toward our sector," Kessler began, his voice steady and calm. "B-17s, most likely. High altitude, 20,000 feet or more. They will have fighter escorts, probably P-47 Thunderbolts. You know these planes. Big, heavy, fast. They protect the bombers, staying high with them, fighting off our interceptors." Franz had seen many P-47s. The Americans called them Thunderbolts, and the name fit. They were massive for fighter planes, with huge radial engines that made them look like flying barrels. They could take tremendous damage and keep flying. German pilots had learned to respect them, even fear them a little. But they knew what P-47s did. They stayed high, protecting the bomber formations, diving down only when German fighters got too close. "We scramble at first warning," Kessler continued. "Standard intercept pattern. Hit the bombers before they reach the rail yards. Avoid prolonged engagement with the escorts if possible. Fuel is limited. Make every second count." Franz noticed something in the major's voice, a hesitation, a small crack in the usual confidence. The other pilots seemed to notice it too. A few shifted on their benches. Someone coughed nervously. Kessler paused, looking down at his notes. Then he said something that made the room grow very quiet. "There have been reports, unusual reports. Some P-47s have been spotted at low altitude, not escorting bombers, flying alone or in small groups, acting independently." One of the younger pilots, a boy named Dieter, who still had soft cheeks and bright eyes, laughed. "Maybe the Americans got lost, sir. Those Thunderbolts are so big, maybe they can't see where they're going." A few other pilots chuckled, but Franz didn't laugh. He watched the major's face and saw no smile there. "The intelligence officer mentioned something else," Kessler said slowly. "These low-flying P-47s appear to be carrying something. We are not sure what, but they are not behaving like escort fighters." The room stayed quiet now. No more jokes. Franz felt something cold move through his chest, like winter wind finding a gap in his jacket. In 4 years of war, he had learned to trust that feeling. It meant danger was coming, even if you couldn't see it yet. "Dismissed," Kessler said. "Stay ready. We may scramble within the hour." His radio crackled again. "Contacts at 2 o'clock. Low, 5,000 feet." Franz looked, and his blood went cold. There, coming fast across the countryside, was a swarm of dark shapes. P-47 Thunderbolts. But they weren't high up protecting bombers. They were low, hugging the ground, racing towards something. And as Franz watched, unable to believe what his eyes were seeing, the lead P-47 dropped something from under its wings. Bombs. The P-47s were carrying bombs. Massive explosions erupted below, right on top of a railroad depot that Franz had driven past 100 times. Fire and smoke billowed up in huge clouds. Buildings vanished in the blasts. Rail cars flew through the air like toys thrown by an angry child. The destruction was total, complete, terrifying. And then the P-47s pulled up, climbing fast, and turned straight toward Franz's squadron. They still had their guns. They still had their speed. They had just dropped bombs like medium bombers, and now they were ready to fight like the deadly fighters they were built to be. Franz's hands tightened on the control stick. His mind raced, trying to understand. Fighter planes didn't do this. Fighter planes fought other fighter planes. They didn't carry tons of bombs and destroy rail depots. That wasn't how war worked. That wasn't how anything worked. But the Americans didn't care about the rules. They had changed everything. And Franz suddenly realized, with terrible clarity, that nothing would ever be the same again. The weeks after that first encounter became a nightmare that Franz lived through again and again. Every morning brought new scrambles, new fights, new P-47s doing things that no fighter plane should be able to do. The pattern emerged slowly, like a terrible picture coming into focus through fog. The Thunderbolts appeared everywhere. They hit bridges with 1,000-pound bombs, turning steel and concrete into twisted wreckage in seconds. They destroyed trains carrying supplies to the front lines, leaving burning cars scattered across the countryside like broken toys. They attacked convoys on the roads, their machine guns tearing through trucks and tanks alike. And then, after dropping their bombs and firing their rockets, they climbed back up into the sky and fought German interceptors with a fury that left Franz breathless. Franz watched a P-47 attack a fuel convoy one cold January morning. The American pilot came in low and fast, maybe 50 feet off the ground, his engine roaring like thunder. He released his bombs, and the fuel trucks exploded in massive fireballs that rolled up into the sky, black and orange, and so hot that Franz could feel the heat even from 1,000 feet above. Then the P-47 pulled up hard, climbing almost straight up, and met Franz's wingman head-on. The dogfight lasted 30 seconds. Franz's wingman went down in flames, his parachute opening just in time. The P-47 flew away, apparently undamaged, heading back toward England. In the briefing room that night, the pilot sat in stunned silence. Someone had written numbers on the board. Each P-47 could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs. That was more than some of Germany's medium bombers could carry, more than planes designed just to drop bombs. And the P-47s did it while still being able to fight, to climb, to outrun almost anything Germany could put in the air. Dieter, the young pilot with the soft face, spoke quietly. "How many of them are there? We shoot one down and 3 more appear the next day." Nobody answered because nobody knew. But Franz had heard rumors from intelligence officers who looked tired and scared. The Americans were building P-47s in huge factories across the ocean, thousands of them. The factory in Farmingdale, New York, produced them like a machine making bullets, one after another, endlessly. While Germany struggled to build a few dozen fighters each month, carefully crafting each one with dwindling supplies of aluminum and fuel, the Americans simply made more and more and more. Franz began to understand something terrible. This wasn't a war between pilots anymore. This wasn't about who was braver or more skilled. This was about who had more factories, more steel, more fuel, more everything. And Germany didn't. Germany was running on empty. The fuel shortage became impossible to ignore. Franz's 40-minute flights became 30-minute flights, then 20 minutes. Sometimes the squadron couldn't scramble at all because there wasn't enough fuel to get the planes off the ground. Meanwhile, the P-47s seemed to fly forever, patrolling for hours, hunting for targets, never stopping, never running out. One afternoon in March, Franz stood at the edge of the airfield and watched a dogfight happen above him. 3 German fighters against 2 P-47s. The German pilots were good, experienced men who knew every trick in the book. But it didn't matter. The P-47s were faster in a dive, tougher in a fight, and when one German plane finally got behind a Thunderbolt and poured bullets into it, the American plane just kept flying. Franz counted 20 hits, maybe more. Pieces flew off the P-47's wings. Smoke poured from its engine, but it kept going, limping back toward England, somehow still in the air. The German fighters had to break off because they were out of fuel. They landed with their tanks bone dry, the engines coughing and sputtering. The pilots climbed out looking defeated, looking old. Franz watched them and felt something break inside his chest. It wasn't fear exactly, it was something worse. It was understanding. The P-47s could take damage that would destroy any German plane. They could carry bombs that would destroy any target. They could fight all day while German fighters had to go home after 20 minutes, and there were always more of them coming. That night, Franz couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk staring at the ceiling, thinking about what he'd seen. The whole structure of war had changed, and nobody had told them. The Americans had taken a fighter plane and turned it into a weapon that did everything. It escorted bombers, it bombed targets itself, it strafed ground targets, it fought enemy fighters, and it did all of these things better than planes designed to do just one of those jobs. His mind kept returning to one image, a P-47 he'd watched 2 days earlier. It had bombed an ammunition depot, completely destroying it in a massive explosion. Then it fired rockets at a command post, blowing it to pieces. Then it had climbed to 20,000 feet and joined a bomber formation heading home, protecting them from German interceptors. All in one mission, one plane, one pilot, one flight. Franz got up and found his journal in his footlocker. By candlelight, he wrote slowly, carefully. How do you fight an enemy who can afford to waste fighters like we waste bullets? They use their best planes like hammers, beating us down day after day. We save our planes like precious jewels, flying them only when we must. But it doesn't matter. They have more hammers. Always more. 2 weeks later, Dieter didn't come back from a mission. Franz saw it happen. A P-47 caught him during a bombing run, firing a short burst that hit Dieter's fuel tank. The Focke-Wulf exploded in midair, a bright orange flower blooming against the gray sky. Franz saw the parachute open, saw Dieter floating down toward a French farm field. He was alive, but his plane was gone, and there were no more planes to replace it. That evening, Franz did something he'd never done before. He asked the engineering officer about the P-47. The man, a thin fellow with glasses and tired eyes, pulled out a folder full of intelligence reports. Republic Aviation, the engineer said, pointing to papers covered in numbers and diagrams. They built a factory in New York just to make these planes. The factory is enormous. It has assembly lines that work day and night. They produce one P-47 every hour. Every single hour. By the time we shoot one down, they've already built 3 more to replace it. Franz stared at the papers. 1 plane every hour. His mind couldn't hold the number. Germany's factories, bombed and starved for materials, might build a dozen fighters in a week if they were lucky. The Americans built 24 in a day, just from 1 factory. And they had other factories too. They can afford to use them as bombers, the engineer continued, because to them, fighters are cheap. They have so many that losing a few doesn't matter. To us, every plane is precious. To them, planes are like, he searched for the word, like ammunition. Franz walked back to his barracks, feeling like he was carrying a heavy stone in his chest. He looked up at the sky, at the stars appearing in the twilight. Somewhere beyond those stars, beyond the ocean, were factories bigger than anything he'd ever seen, making planes faster than he could count them, sending them across the water in an endless stream. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Nothing any of them could do. The war had stopped being about courage or skill months ago. Now it was just about numbers, and the numbers said Germany had already lost. The war ended on a Tuesday in May, though for Franz it had ended months earlier in the sky over Normandy. He had been captured in late November of 1944 when his crippled Focke-Wulf finally gave up and he parachuted into a field near the Belgian border. American soldiers found him within an hour, their rifles pointed at his chest, their faces young and cautious. He'd raised his hands and felt nothing but relief. The war was over for him, even if it wasn't over for everyone else. They took him to England on a transport ship that smelled of oil and salt water. Franz stood on the deck watching the French coast disappear behind him, thinking about all the times he'd flown over that same water, hunting and being hunted. Now he was just cargo, another prisoner among thousands, moving across the channel like a piece of furniture being shipped to storage. The POW camp was in the English countryside, surrounded by green fields that reminded him painfully of Bavaria. Rows of barracks stood inside wire fences, neat and organized like everything the Americans did. Franz was given a bunk, a blanket, and a tin cup. He was also given something he hadn't expected, 3 meals a day, every day, with more food than he'd seen in years. The first breakfast stunned him. Eggs, real eggs, not the powdered substitute he'd eaten at the airbase. Bread that was soft and white, not the hard black bread made from sawdust and hope. There was butter, actual butter that tasted rich and creamy. And coffee, strong and hot, didn't taste like burnt acorns. Franz sat at the long wooden table in the mess hall and ate slowly, trying to make it last, wondering if this was some kind of trick. But it wasn't a trick. The next day brought more food, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every single day, 3 times a day, more food than Franz could finish. He watched other German prisoners eating with the same confusion he felt, their faces showing the same question. How could the enemy have so much when Germany had so little? The camp guards were mostly American soldiers, young men who chewed gum and listened to music on small radios. They weren't cruel. They didn't beat prisoners or starve them or make them work until they collapsed. They just watched, making sure nobody escaped, doing their jobs with a casual efficiency that Franz found more unsettling than cruelty would have been. It was as if guarding thousands of enemy prisoners was just another ordinary task, like washing dishes or fixing a truck. One guard, a mechanic named Robert from somewhere called Ohio, sometimes talked to Franz through the fence. Robert was maybe 22, with red hair and freckles and an easy smile that seemed out of place in a war. He worked on the camp's vehicles, keeping jeeps and trucks running, and sometimes Franz would watch him work, reminded of Werner and his careful hands on the Focke-Wulf's engine. One afternoon in March, Robert was changing the oil in a jeep near the fence where Franz stood. They'd been talking about nothing in particular, the weather, the mud, small things that didn't matter. Then Robert pulled something from his pocket and held it up. It was a photograph, bent at the corners from being carried around. "My dad," Robert said, showing Franz the picture. It showed a large factory building with hundreds of windows and a sign that Franz couldn't quite read. He works at the Republic Aviation plant, builds P-47s. Franz felt his heart stop for a moment. He stared at the photograph, at the enormous building that seemed to stretch on forever. "That's one factory?" he asked quietly. "Yeah," Robert said, pride in his voice. "They make about one plane every hour, sometimes more if they're running extra shifts. Dad says they've got assembly lines so long you could walk for 5 minutes and not reach the end. Thousands of people working there, building fighters as fast as they can rivet them together." Franz took the photograph with shaking hands. He looked at the building, trying to understand its size. One factory, one plane every hour. He thought about the small workshops in Germany, the careful craftsmen building fighters one piece at a time, with materials that were always running short. He thought about how precious every single plane had been, how losing one felt like losing a limb.
"We shot down many of your planes," Franz said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Many P-47s, but there was always more." Robert shrugged, taking the photo back. "Yeah, well, we build them faster than you could shoot them down. That was kind of the point." He said it casually, like he was talking about making sandwiches, not weapons of war. Like overwhelming the enemy with sheer production was just common sense. Franz walked away from the fence, feeling hollowed out inside. That night, he lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York. He thought about thousands of workers building planes on assembly lines, one after another, endlessly. He thought about ships carrying those planes across the ocean, about airfields in England filling up with Thunderbolts, about American pilots climbing into fresh aircraft while German pilots nursed worn-out machines that were held together with prayers and improvised parts. The war ended officially on May 8th. The camp loudspeakers announced it in the morning, the American voice reading a statement about Germany's unconditional surrender. Franz was working in the camp garden when he heard it, pulling weeds from between rows of vegetables. He stopped working and sat down in the dirt, his hands still covered in soil, and felt nothing. No relief, no sadness, no anger, just emptiness. The war was over, and Germany had lost, and somehow he'd known it would end this way since that first day he'd seen P-47s dropping bombs on the rail depot. The other prisoners had mixed reactions. Some cried, some sat in silence. A few cheered, glad it was finally over, glad they'd survived. But most just looked tired, like men who'd been carrying heavy loads for too long and had finally been allowed to set them down. They stayed in the camp for months after that. The Americans were in no hurry to send anyone home. There were millions of prisoners scattered across Europe, all needing to be processed and documented and eventually transported back to countries that might not exist anymore in the same form. So they waited. Franz read books from the camp library, mostly in English now, as he'd been learning the language from Robert and other guards. He worked in the garden, he played chess with other pilots, and he thought about what came next. In September, they told him he could go home. Germany was divided now, split into pieces controlled by different Allied powers. Bavaria was in the American zone, so Franz would be allowed to return to his hometown. They gave him papers, some money, and a travel voucher for the train. Then they opened the gates and let him walk out. The journey home took 5 days. The trains barely ran, stopping and starting, breaking down, waiting for tracks to be repaired. Franz sat in crowded cars filled with other former prisoners, all of them heading home to places they weren't sure they'd recognize. Nobody talked much. They just looked out the windows at the countryside passing by, at the bombed-out cities and destroyed bridges, and fields that were slowly turning green again. Franz crossed into Germany and felt his chest tighten. Everything looked wrong. The cities he'd known were gone, replaced by piles of rubble with narrow paths cleared through them. People walked through these ruins like ghosts, thin and pale and moving slowly. Children played in the wreckage, building forts from broken bricks, their laughter sounding strange in the silence. When the train finally reached Bavaria, Franz got off and started walking toward his hometown. It was 15 miles away, but he wanted to walk it, wanted to feel the ground under his feet, wanted to see slowly how much had changed. The countryside looked better than the cities, still green and rolling, though many farms stood empty with broken windows and overgrown fields. He reached his town in the late afternoon. The church tower still stood, though its bells were gone, melted down from metal years ago. Many houses were damaged, some completely destroyed, but the streets were still there, the layout still familiar. Franz walked slowly, recognizing each corner, each tree, seeing his childhood in every stone, even though so much had changed. His family's house stood at the end of a narrow street. The roof had a hole in it, covered now with canvas. The fence was gone. The garden where his mother had grown roses was just dirt and weeds, but the house still stood. Franz stopped at the gate and stood there for a long moment, his hands gripping the travel bag that held everything he owned. The door opened and a woman appeared. She was thin, much thinner than Franz remembered, her hair gray instead of brown. She looked at him for a long second, her eyes searching his face. Then she cried out and ran toward him.
"Franz! Oh God, Franz!" His mother held him and cried, and Franz held her back, feeling how fragile she'd become, how the war had taken weight from everyone, how it had taken everything. They stood in the street together while neighbors came out to look, while word spread that Adler's boy had come home from the war. Inside the house, his mother made tea from leaves she dried herself. There was no real tea anymore. There was barely anything anymore. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Franz had eaten breakfast before school when he was a boy, and his mother told him about the last 5 years. His father had died in 1943, his heart giving out one night while he slept. Maybe it was the stress, maybe it was age, maybe it was just his time. His younger sister had married and moved to Munich with her husband. His older brother had died on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1944. So many people are gone. So many families are broken into pieces. "We thought you were dead too," his mother said, her voice shaking. "When we didn't hear anything for so long, we thought—" "I was in England," Franz said, "in a prisoner camp. They fed us well. They treated us fairly. I was lucky." His mother looked at him strangely when he said that, like she couldn't quite understand how being captured by the enemy could be lucky. But Franz knew it was true. He'd survived. He'd been fed. He hadn't frozen or starved or been shot. Compared to what had happened to his brother, to millions of others, he'd been very lucky indeed. That night, Franz lay in his old bed, in his old room, and couldn't sleep. The house felt wrong, too empty, too quiet. He got up and lit a candle and found his journal in his travel bag. He'd carried it through the war, through captivity, through the long journey home. Now he opened it and read his own words from years ago, from another lifetime.
How do you fight an enemy who can afford to waste fighters like we waste bullets? He'd written that in the winter of 1944, after watching P-47s destroy everything they touched. Now, reading it again in the candlelight, France understood something deeper. It wasn't about waste. The Americans hadn't been wasting anything. They'd been using their strength, their industrial power, their ability to produce more of everything than anyone else could imagine. They'd turned that strength into a weapon more powerful than any bomb or bullet. They'd simply made more, built more, sent more, until there was nothing left to oppose them. France took out a pencil and wrote slowly, carefully, thinking about each word. We were told we were the best pilots in the world. Maybe we were. But being the best doesn't win wars when the other side has 10 planes for every one of yours. Being the best doesn't matter when you run out of fuel and they don't. Being the best is meaningless when their factories build in 1 hour what your factories build in 1 week. He paused, thinking about Robert's photograph, about that enormous factory in New York, about assembly lines stretching so far you could walk for 5 minutes and not reach the end. The P-47 taught me what power really means. It's not about courage or skill or determination. Power is the ability to make so many weapons that losing some doesn't matter. Power is having so much fuel that your planes can fly for hours while ours fly for minutes. Power is turning your fighters into bombers and still having enough fighters left over to control the sky. We never understood that. We thought the war was about who fought better, but it was really about who could build more, and we couldn't. The candle burned low. France closed the journal and lay back down, but sleep still wouldn't come. His mind kept turning over the same thoughts, the same realizations, like a machine stuck repeating the same motion forever. The next morning, he walked through the town, seeing it clearly in daylight for the first time. The destruction was worse than he'd thought. Whole blocks were gone. The school where he'd learned to read was just a shell with no roof. The market square where farmers had sold vegetables was a crater filled with rubble. People moved through this wreckage with quiet determination, clearing paths, salvaging bricks, trying to rebuild something from nothing.
France stopped at the town square where a group of men were working to clear debris. He recognized a few of them, boys he'd grown up with, now men with tired eyes and worn hands. They greeted him carefully, not quite sure what to say to someone who'd been flying for the Luftwaffe while they'd been here watching everything collapse. "We need help," one of them said finally. His name was Klaus, and he'd been 2 years ahead of Franz in school. "If you're strong enough to work." Franz looked at the rubble, at the enormous task ahead of them. "I can work," he said simply. So he did. Day after day, Franz joined the work crews clearing debris, salvaging materials, beginning the slow process of rebuilding. It was hard physical labor that left his muscles aching and his hands blistered. But it felt right somehow, using his body to create instead of destroy, building up instead of tearing down. During lunch breaks, the men would sit together and talk. Slowly, carefully, they shared their stories. What they'd seen, what they'd survived, what they'd lost. France told them about the P-47s, about watching helplessly as American fighters did the impossible, about understanding too late that Germany had been fighting a war it couldn't win. "We were lied to," Klaus said one day, his voice bitter. "They told us we were winning, right up until the end. They told us German engineering was superior, that our weapons were the best, that victory was certain. All lies." France thought about that. Maybe they believed it themselves, he said quietly. Maybe they couldn't see the truth either. Or maybe they just couldn't admit it. But yes, they were lies. Or at least they were wishes pretending to be facts. We wished we were stronger than we were. We wished our weapons were better than they were. We wished we could win. But wishing doesn't make things true. As the weeks passed, Franz began to understand the full extent of Germany's defeat. It wasn't just military. It wasn't just political. It was total. The country was broken in ways that would take decades to fix, if they could be fixed at all. The economy had collapsed. The infrastructure was destroyed. Trust in institutions, in leaders, in the future itself had been shattered. But people kept working. They cleared rubble and planted gardens and fixed roofs and slowly, painfully, began to build something new. France watched children playing in the streets and wondered what kind of country they would grow up in, what kind of Germany could rise from these ruins. In October, a teacher came to see him. Her name was Frau Weber, and she'd taught at the school before the war. Now she was trying to restart classes in a building that still had most of its walls and a roof that didn't leak too badly. "I need help," she said to Franz. "I need someone who can teach the older children about the world, about what happened, about how to think clearly. Someone who has seen things and learned from them. Would you consider it?" Franz looked at her in surprise. "I'm a pilot," he said. "I know about engines and tactics and flying. I don't know about teaching." "You know about the consequences," Frau Weber said firmly. "You know about what happens when people believe lies and follow false ideas. You know about the cost of delusion. That's what these children need to learn. Not more propaganda, not more easy answers. They need someone who can help them think for themselves." Franz thought about it for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "I'll try," he said. So he became a teacher, standing in front of a classroom of children whose fathers were dead or missing, whose homes were damaged or destroyed, whose childhood had been stolen by a war they didn't understand. Franz didn't teach them about glory or honor or patriotic duty. He taught them about thinking clearly, about questioning what they were told, about understanding the difference between what they wished was true and what actually was true. He told them about the P-47s, though he made sure to explain it in terms they could grasp. He talked about how Germany had believed its own propaganda, had thought it was stronger than it really was, and had ignored the signs that it was fighting a war it couldn't win. He talked about American factories, about production capacity, about how wars were won not just by brave soldiers, but by the nations that could make more weapons, more supplies, more of everything. "The Americans didn't beat us because they were braver," Franz told his students one cold November morning. The classroom was unheated, and everyone wore their coats inside, their breath making small clouds in the air. "They didn't beat us because they were smarter or more determined. They beat us because they could make more planes, more tanks, more bullets, more of everything. They had factories that worked day and night, producing weapons faster than we could destroy them. And we couldn't match that. We didn't have the resources or the industry or the raw materials." A girl in the front row, maybe 13 years old, raised her hand. "So we never had a chance to win?" Franz thought carefully before answering. "We might have had a chance, in the beginning, if we'd made different choices. But once the war became about production, about who could build more weapons, we had already lost. We just didn't know it yet, or we refused to believe it." Another student, a boy with serious eyes, asked, "Why didn't our leaders see this? Why didn't they stop?" "That's a good question," Franz said. "I think they couldn't admit they were wrong. Or maybe they were too afraid to stop. Or maybe they really believed their own lies. I don't know. But I know this. When you refuse to see the truth, when you believe only what you want to believe, you make terrible mistakes. And those mistakes cost lives." The children listened quietly. They'd all lost someone. They all knew the cost he was talking about. Franz continued teaching through the winter. The work was hard and frustrating and often felt hopeless. But slowly, he saw his students begin to question things, to think for themselves, to ask why instead of just accepting what they were told. It wasn't much. It wouldn't fix Germany or bring back the dead or undo the damage. But it was something. A small seed planted in ground that had been burned and salted by war. At night, Franz continued writing in his journal. He wrote about his students, about the town's slow recovery, about his own struggle to understand what had happened and what it meant. He wrote about the P-47s and what they represented, about the lesson he'd learned in the sky over France. "Power isn't what we thought it was," he wrote one February evening in 1946. "We thought power was about having the best weapons, the best trained soldiers, the most disciplined forces. But real power is simpler and more terrible than that. Real power is having more. More factories, more resources, more ability to replace what you lose. The Americans could afford to use their fighters as bombers because they had so many fighters. They could afford to lose planes because they could build new ones faster than we could shoot them down. That's power, not pride or propaganda or determination. Just more." He paused, thinking about Robert, about that photograph of Republic Aviation, about assembly lines producing one plane every hour. We were fighting the 20th century with 19th century ideas. We thought wars were still decided by courage and tactics and superior skill. But that war is over. Modern war is industrial. It's about who can produce more, faster, longer. And we couldn't. We never could. That's what the P-47 taught me, flying there in the sky with 2,500 pounds of bombs under its wings. It taught me that the rules had changed, and we hadn't noticed. Spring came slowly to Bavaria. The trees began to bloom, small green leaves appearing on branches that had been bare all winter. Farmers started planting crops again. People began to hope, carefully and quietly, that maybe life could continue. Maybe something new could grow from the ruins. Franz continued teaching, continued working on reconstruction, and continued trying to make sense of everything that had happened. He was 30 years old now, though he felt much older. His youth had been spent in the cockpit of a fighter plane, hunting and being hunted, watching friends die, slowly understanding that everything he'd believed was wrong. One warm April afternoon, Franz walked out to the edge of town, where a small hill overlooked the valley. He stood there watching the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He thought about all the sunsets he'd seen from the cockpit of his Focke-Wulf, thousands of feet in the air, the world spread out below him like a map. He loved flying. He loved the freedom of it, the skill required, the way it made him feel separate from the earth and its problems. But that love had been tangled up with lies and delusion and a war that should never have been fought. Now the flying was over and the war was over, and all that remained was the truth, hard and cold and undeniable. Franz took out his journal one last time. He wrote slowly, choosing his words with care, trying to capture everything he'd learned. "I spent years in the cockpit, fighting for a cause I believed was righteous and necessary. I watched friends die. I killed people I never met, people who probably had families and dreams just like mine. I did these things because I believed Germany was right, that we were defending our homeland, that we would win because we deserved to win." He stopped writing and looked at the valley, at his town rebuilding itself stone by stone. "But the Americans didn't defeat me with ideology or propaganda or determination. They defeated me with ice cream in POW camps, with factories that produced one plane every hour, with an industrial capacity that turned weapons into commodities. They defeated me with a fighter plane that could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs and still shoot me down in a dogfight. That's what I learned in captivity. That's what I brought home with me." The sun touched the horizon, turning everything golden. Power isn't about pride or courage or skill. Power is having so much that you can afford to use your best weapons like hammers, spending them freely because you know more are coming. Power is building faster than the enemy can destroy. Power is turning abundance into overwhelming force. Germany forgot that, or never understood it. We thought willpower and determination could overcome material disadvantages. We were wrong, and that mistake cost millions of lives. Franz closed the journal and sat watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow he would go back to teaching, back to clearing rubble, back to the slow work of building a new Germany from the ashes of the old one. He would tell his students about the P-47s and what they represented. He would try to help them understand that wars weren't won by heroes and glory, but by factories and resources and the cold mathematics of production. It wasn't a hopeful lesson, it wasn't inspiring or uplifting, but it was true. And Franz had learned, at terrible cost, that truth mattered more than inspiration. Truth was what you built on. Truth was what let you see clearly. Truth was what kept you from making the same mistakes again. The stars came out, the same stars that had guided him through countless night flights, that had watched silently as empires rose and fell and millions died. Franz stood up, picked up his journal, and walked back down the hill toward town. There was work to do tomorrow. There was always work to do. But at least now he understood what he was working for, and why, and what the alternative had cost. The P-47 Thunderbolt had taught him that lesson, taught it in fire and thunder and the undeniable reality of 2,500 pounds of bombs falling from a fighter plane that wasn't supposed to carry them. It was a hard lesson, paid for in blood and defeat, but it was learned now, written in his journal and carved into his memory, and passed on to students who would, he hoped, remember it better than his generation had. And that was something. Not redemption, not forgiveness, not absolution for what he'd done or what Germany had done. Just understanding. Just the truth. Just the knowledge, hard-won and terrible, of what power really meant in the modern world. It would have to be enough. It was all he had left to give. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.